how I came across this really emerging, greatly needed discussed topic is that I had realized that I had a lot of intersectional projects with Janet and other individuals. So we kind of knew each other, knew about each other, but we hadn't connected. So we had an awesome opportunity, Janet Warner and I, to connect. And I did feel safe to share some of my journey and the uniqueness. And there was the childlike wonder of some of my disability that was weaponized as well. And of course, the word religiosity, because I believed in things that maybe the world would say were outlandish. And I often say, is it is it creative or is it crazy? Is it innovative or is it a delusion? Right. And so I think I just want to clear the space to have this conversation because I've done a lot of things. I know I should be in an institution right now. So how about believing in the unbelievable? And so I'm stating that we have to have hope. And I think that there's times it can be even the hope we're trying to keep alive in ourselves when medications and different things are, sucking the hope and the life out of us as we're working through stuff. That, we can have some conversation and not have it just be judged. So I'm really grateful for that. And in that dialogue, we did discuss that, there was several incidences, and we do get permission. And when it was free, of what they shared with us for Shield alerts. So I scanned it. I scanned our last year shield alerts upon the criteria. I'm going to put in the chat what the spiritual crisis criteria is. And I think a lot of people may be surprised what it actually is because I think it's been defined very differently or possibly not presented in a way that people would even want to acknowledge that some of it is. And so I do want to share. I'm sorry, there's sirens going on in the back. But I'm going to put that in the chat because it actually came, if we're doing the numbers, it was just say 3 out of 5 were experiencing a very high level of crisis, of spiritual crisis, and less of what we would say is a mental health crisis. There were a lot of components to it. And like I said, I'm in the chat. I'm going to put what that criteria is, how it does get measured by. You're going to learn a lot more about that tonight. And oh my gosh, I didn't introduce myself. I'm so sorry. I'm KK. I don't even have my name on the screen. I am the president and CEO of MindFreedom International, and it is truly an honor, a privilege, and a joy to present this dialogue this evening. And so, Dr. Calvin, would you like to start us off?
Um, KK, were you going to show the statistics, or you just said it, the 3 out of 5?
I'm going to be putting the data in the chat for everybody. I didn't want to divert from, your presentation. But if you'd like me to, I could share a little bit of it further if you want to drill down on it, and I can put it in the chat.
Okay. While you're doing that, I'm Dr. Chatlos. I'm a child and adolescent and addiction psychiatrist in New Jersey. And I actually got acquainted with Janet and Brett, both are in New Jersey, around this topic of spiritual emergencies, spiritual crises. I'm a psychiatrist in addiction, and in working with addiction, there's a lot to focus on spirituality in general, especially as part of the 12 steps. So that was my interest for the last 30 or so years. And Janet brought it to my attention about people that were having spiritual experiences that may progress to crisis and emergency that were getting caught up in the mental health system. And some of you may have done that. The typical scenario is the intensity gets stronger. If someone isn't familiar with it, they may get afraid. It may be confusing. And usually family members or coworkers or friends ask for a wellness check, or uh, somehow the police get involved. And once they get involved, they're almost obligated to take a person like that to an emergency room where they could be assessed and hopefully not mentalized, so to speak, but that often isn't the case. So part of what our goal is to bring awareness, first of all, that there are such things as spiritual experiences. They're real, they're meaningful, that they can get out of control, and they can look very much like pure mental health crises because they can be extreme, they can be intense, they can have delusions, they can have visions, they can hear voices, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a mental disorder. So I'm not sure, and I think, Judi, I'll tack on to what you said. Probably one of the most horrible things for people in that situation is to be put in a hospital. And often involuntarily committed, forced medicated, and the medications just take over who that person is and don't even allow them their own agency to defend themselves. Um, so I think I may stop there and be around. I did have to tell Judi I have to leave at 7 so that about 5 of 7. So if there are questions in the chat, if you would bring them to my attention before I have to leave, I'd love to help.
Okay, so can I go and jump on right after this? Can I go?
Go.
So, a connection from Dr. Chatlos is when we met a few years ago. Dr. Chatlos spent a full day with me, and I'm going to say it like you pronounce me not bipolar, and I most definitely had a spiritual experience of which I knew anyway, even if, that wasn't the outcome of our day together. So my brief is 1979. I was 25 in college in my master's degree for counseling, and I had been going through a divorce, and I would call it at a young age. And I became very upset because I didn't have any support. I didn't have a support system around me. And so I was frightened of going through this divorce and what that meant. And in a moment in the car, I was crying and I cried out to who I call God. And in a moment, the tears dried up and I was astonished. And it truly felt like my first mystical experience. And so that was a jolt of an awakening for me, which would have been all fine and good. But as I progressed back into my college semester, the energy would be rising, unsuspecting by me. So the awakening continued to happen, and I didn't have anybody to speak to. So it turned into a bit of an emergency, and I wound up in the hospital. At that time, I didn't know how to define it. I didn't hear of the term spiritual emergency. I did not study Stan Grof's work. So I just laid low, got through my 2 weeks in the hospital, accepted forced medication, but I 100% knew for me it was a Holy Spirit mystical moment that was very healthy. And I wound up getting out of the hospital, off my meds, and then onto my life. So that would be my first one where I was forced in the hospital and no one knew anything about spiritual experiences. They just called me manic depressive at that time. So my second part of my story is I went 25 years on a mission to do good work out with the public and corporate America. And in 2005, I wound up having another spiritual awakening, but this time it was very gradual. So I went through a few months of recuperating from a very challenging business failure. And I was very excited that holistic tools and meditation and prayer and all that helped me get back on my feet. part of that process was an awakening that I recognized, which again, I thought was great and, very thankful that I could heal. So I went on Wall Street to present for funding of how do we bring attention to the spiritual side of mental health? How do we train psychiatrists, first responders, which all went well until I went home and shared it with my family or my mother. And she did not really quite understand why I did it, why this came out after 25 years that I'm advocating for the spiritual side of mental health. And she actually called the police on me. I was not overly acting out, and I'll leave that for when you see it in the documentary. But I had to be escorted into a psychiatric hospital. I spent 11 days there. Again, fully sane for the 11 days, forced on lithium. Once again, when I got out, I just continued my advocacy work. So I do not believe I'm bipolar. Um, I absolutely know I had a full-blown spiritual experience that turned into emergency. And I think partially because I didn't have anybody to talk to. So we'll get into the discussion later. So Brett, Calvin, and I are all working on a documentary on orienting first responders on how to slow it down and not react to bring somebody right into a hospital, potentially bring clergy in if the person wants or peer support. So we're really looking to try to stop the immediate hospitalization to give a chance to really understand what's going on. So that's my brief, and I'm going to hand it off to my other partner, Brett, who also has lived experience and is doing advocacy work with us.
All right. Thank you, Janet. And thank you, KK, for having me. You know, it's interesting, and I may be a case of a mix of various things. And I'm also friendly with Dr. Chatlos and working with him a little bit. So I'll give Calvin, in case it makes sense at any point, I give you permission to share, relatively speaking, anything we may have talked about, or if you ever want to use me as an example or talk about me in some way here tonight that isn't helpful or serving the conversation, I'll give you permission to do that in any way that might serve the conversation. Um, so I'm 51 now. In 1994, in December, after a couple of months of being obsessed with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, a book from the 70s that some of you may know, which was a philosophical, mystical inquiry into the nature of reality, basically. I kind of got obsessed with that book and started automatic writing in my notebooks. I started not sleeping very well. And then I had an outer body experience and I went home to see my folks. I was supposed to go to Italy with a friend, so I went home on the bus from New York to New Jersey to get my tickets. And when I got home, I had further intense experiences and was crying in front of them and my sister, and I was definitely in a non-ordinary, super intense state at that point. And I got taken to the hospital by my dad, and I just went along for the ride. I had no idea what was really going on. I didn't question it. They thought I was on drugs. Obviously, they had no experience with psychedelics or religion or anything like that. So their first inclination was I must be on drugs. So they took me to the hospital, and I did the thing which many of you would be familiar with if you've had these experiences. I sat in the emergency room for several hours. They took my blood. They made me wait. They put me in a room, and then they walked out. And at some point, sitting in that room, I decided I wanted to leave. I saw my mom and dad outside, and I wanted to talk to them. And when I went to leave, the door was locked. Um, and as soon as that happened, I was basically like a caged animal. And I noticed there was a camera up in the top of the room, and I started going nuts. Let me out of here, let me out of here. Of course, I assumed that for them meant that I was a danger to myself or others. So they came to get me with some kind of sedative that they carry, which they have to carry the antidote with because it gives some people convulsions of some kind. So they pulled me out of the room. They gave me the shot, and I did go into convulsions, which for me was very scary. I thought I was dying. I remember screaming, "Mommy, I'm dying," like literally in front of my mom. So for me, I had the, you could say my nervous system was registering what the heck's going on. I'm having convulsions and all this. Um, and then they had to give me the antidote, and I spent 3 weeks in the hospital. Um, that's how in a non-ordinary state I was. I mean, I literally was in the psychiatric ward for 3 or 4 weeks on all the heavy medications, and I was still having mystical experiences in the hospital like within a week or two. And I got taken to another clinic where I was diagnosed with bipolar 3 months later. So the story is longer than that. And then I was also taken many times over the next 7 or 8 years against my will and medicated and fighting with the guards at the hospitals and this, that, and the other thing. So for me, it was a whole decade, I like to say. I was very stubborn. I wanted to learn a lot of things. So one trip to the system was not enough for me. I had to go 5 or 6 times to really to really get a gist of what was happening. And it's funny because back then I was reading a lot of different materials. I was reading a lot of Ken Wilber's work about transpersonal psychology and learning about the humanistic movement and Groff and all that, but there was really nobody around to talk to that about and not many resources, so it was basically on my own. But for me, it's funny, I didn't have the word spiritual emergency back then, but I always felt like the whole thing was spiritual. So I'm a little bit on the scale of like human dignity itself. Like, I don't care if you have a mental illness or not, or you have a spiritual experience. I'm still sick and tired of how people are being treated and the situations and the hospitals and the coercion and the medication and just the attitudes of pathologization. So I'll just share that just as a wholeness. I don't even care if there's anything wrong with us or not or whatever. There's something wrong. We all know that with the system, no matter what angle we're coming into it from. Um, and for me, I'm as a philosopher, existential kind of person, I believe we're all spiritual. So for me, everything is a spiritual emergence, whether it's cancer or IBS or bipolar disorder or anything. It's all a spiritual manifestation of a spiritual life that we're living. So it's a spectrum for me. Everything's on the spectrum, and it's really important how we treat each other. And I had a big mix, so therefore I have a personal stake in always having wanting to make changes in the system. And I have a background in technology development and sort of a polymath. So I've done a little bit of everything. So I'm always looking at all the different things we can bring together, like filmmaking, Web3 technology, and innovation, and how can we start getting more artistic and more creative in terms of addressing the systemic issues that the system has. And for me, the times now, I mean, just based on everyone on this call and the work of people like Bob Whitaker and Janet and Calvin and all the people around the world talking about neurodiversity, for me, this is more of a zeitgeist moment. And I hope that the community and the planetary movement really latches onto something new and we go beyond what we've done before and we really come together and make some changes on the planet. For me, that the time is absolutely right now to do something like that. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to point at there's a couple things I want to share as we did have some intersectional projects as well, because you did actually highlight something. The definition that Samsa gives for spirituality is a purpose. It is identifying the driving purpose in your life, the driving force. And so when you use and adapt that terminology, I think every human goes through that moment where we go, "Oh my gosh, what am I doing with my life?" And I mean, do I have a purpose on this earth? It's part of the human mystery. um, I can share with you very briefly. I do want to let the question before Dr. Calvin leaves, but I'm gonna just circle back around, share a quick minute after we get this question because this is a big one, Dr. Calvin. Because often I think a lot of us feel that our experiences are part of our human journey can possibly get weaponized. And so I do really ask. Uh, Sarah, would you like to come off mute so you can ask it effectively?
Sure. Thank
Okay.
you. I This is a question for the psychiatrist who has to leave in less than an hour. Um, I belong to a parent support group, and the overwhelming number of parents in the support group believe that if their grown son or daughter rejects the standard psychiatric intervention, because maybe their son or daughter thinks it's ineffective or it's harmful, and maybe they don't express it coherently. Maybe they just simply refuse it, or they're afraid, or they have a strong reaction, or they say, "Oh, I don't need it. There's nothing wrong with it." And the parents overwhelmingly believe they pathologize that attitude, and they call it anosognosia. Help me. It's a medical term, anosognosia.
Anasarnosia.
Oh, thank
Anasarnosia.
you.
Now you got
And
me to it.
thank you. So thank you, KK. So my question is do you think, like I think that term is overused to take away people's autonomy or rights, and since medical people have basically put that in the DSM, how can we support young adults if they get accused of having that additional pathology?
Um, I'll try to take a stab at it. First of all, it's not a diagnosable mental disorder in the DSM. So it's identified as a character or a symptom of some possible mental disorders. However, for the most part, it's identified with that specific term with biological illnesses like strokes, like traumatic brain injuries, like Alzheimer's disease, like neurological disorders. So technically, in those frameworks, it has a different meaning than would be used in mental health. And yes, I could see it would be very easy to weaponize it. And what you're really saying is someone doesn't have insight into their condition, and that may be for many reasons. Medically, our concern is it a true medical condition that needs attention or a neurological condition? And that should be where our focus stays. To use the fact that it would even be used as a term in a mental health setting really does speak to weaponizing the mental health system and mental health language, because I'm not sure that using that term would give any more information to me as a psychiatrist or a mental health worker than just saying they don't recognize or understand or comprehend what's happening with them, not necessarily attributing it to some sort of disorder like that. Do you know what I mean? Um, my first impression would be to look at, okay, they don't get it. The evidence seems to be there. Well, what's getting in the way? And that really should be the question rather than throwing on a label or another diagnosis. So I don't know if that helps you in any way, but it definitely can be disempowering, invalidating, and I would say as a mental health professional, mostly unnecessary for us to use that term unless we're referring to a neurological or pure brain disorder where it has a different set of implications.
Thank you.
Does that sort of answer?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for addressing that, because that is something that we are seeing over and over again.
Yep.
Just to be transparent, that the minute you do not opt fully in with no questions asked, or if you use some critical thinking, or family members and loved ones do, this is often comes alongside, and they are automatically labeled that way. And you can find out devastatingly by requesting charts, or the nurse will say it offhand, and it's heartbreaking. So it is really silencing any outside advocacy voices for an individual that is enduring some, let's say, in just systematic treatments, right? So Brett, you had your hand up. I'm going to share something really quick. Russ, if you want to ask a quick question, if it's to Dr. Calvin, we can get you in real quick. Brett, go
Well, I
ahead.
go,
Let's have Russell go
go ahead.
first. Go ahead, Russell.
Okay, go ahead.
Uh,
Oh, yeah,
I'll
hello?
go. I'll go. I was going to ask Dr. Chatlos if you could do just a very, very quick high level share with everyone how psychiatry sees the difference between a mental disorder and then a spiritual or moral injury problem, in the DSM, right? There's two different things. There's like the code for the spiritual problem is one thing, but it's not a diagnosis of an illness, whereas part of the DSM is about like, quote, mental illness. I was just wondering if you could share quickly for everyone, just so we have the context of how psychiatry, sees these things, that there's a slight difference there in the DSM, as far as I understand it. Like,
Sure, I'll try. Psychiatry looks for groups of symptoms that come together as syndromes that we might refer to as mental disorders. There is no diagnosis in psychiatry related to spiritual experiences. In fact, unfortunately, I think the field minimizes the importance of spiritual experience so that they're put in as what's called a V code, or a clinical condition that needs attention but is not a diagnosis. They caution us to at least be aware of them, though training programs often aren't. Psychiatrists and mental health practitioners are not taught about them, let alone what to do. The problem is that there are some mental disorders, and Janet had mentioned, and I think Brett, something such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, where the symptoms may be similar to what would be seen in a spiritual experience, primarily excessive energy, increased activity, effect on sleep, changes in thinking that may include delusions, thoughts that are not in reality. There may be hallucinations. So there is an overlap. However, one of the things that's different, or several of the things that are very important, one is a spiritual emergency or a spiritual crisis is going to have some content that has to do with religion or spirituality. Now, that can always be tacked on and said that's part of bipolar disorder, hyperreligiosity, but that term is often used without any more exploration into the nature of the religious ideation or religious or spiritual experience they're having. So I think that's what makes it complicated, is though the overlap in some of the symptoms. Several of the things, though, that we would like to have psychiatrists and mental health practitioners know more about is, if by any chance we err on the side of caution and assume that maybe it is a spiritual experience until proven otherwise, it's much less likely. They're not likely to be suicidal. They're not likely to be homicidal. Their mind, for the most part, is still thinking clear enough to carry on a conversation about other parts of their life. And medications are almost the worst thing for something like that, because it takes away whatever agency they have to make sense of this overwhelming experience. I think I'm looking at someone had asked about something called moral injury. I'll briefly say it and then others can talk about it. In treating veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, about 25 to 30% don't get better with common medications and psychotherapeutic treatments. And what they've learned in the last 10 years is that it's because there's an injury that's deeper than just our rational thinking or our emotions. There's a deeper level of heart and soul functioning or experience that gets injured. And it may have to do with betrayals of systems, of supervisors. It may have to do with contradictions in a belief system with what they're seeing in front of them or what they were forced to do. It may have to do with impact on their ability to have compassion because they've seen such villainous, violent, heartless acts that are against our moral core. What we are finding is that part of our spiritual nature is to have an embodied moral compass. I give the best example. Most of you remember several years ago watching the video of George Floyd and the policeman basically killing him. And if you remember, you had probably a gut reaction. This is not right. That's built into us. There's a gut reaction when self-worth and dignity are being injured that we often don't pay attention to. And that's what's interesting in looking at, there's a real question. When someone with a true spiritual experience comes into an emergency room, what is really going on that the mental health practitioners don't treat them with the respect that any person, even with a mental disorder, should get? Part of it, we question, may be the mental health field is known to be much less religious, much less spiritual than the average population by at least 30, 40%. So is there something about their dismissal of religion and spirituality that comes from their own personal life injuries? And are they being triggered as professionals by someone that might be having a true spiritual experience? That, unfortunately, isn't even being looked at by the profession yet at this time. I think I'll turn it over to maybe Brett or Janet to add to that or some questions. I think Russell's still trying to ask a question.
Yeah, Russell, if you want to get your question in real quick.
Yes, thank you for your dealing with this. I guess I'll add sort of a nuance to it because I've seen what they call anosognosia up close and personal with people that I love, and yes, clearly there's that idea of not being aware of sort of how off base they are, which will be recognized later. But there's also, I see along with it, a spiritual nuance that it often gets dismissed as all part of that, which rather than being explored as perhaps how to help someone get through that particular thing. And then on the other hand, there's something that Peter Bregan refers to it as drug spellbinding. I've seen that in people where they just seem totally unaware of how certain medications and treatments have rendered them different. And more so and more concerning is how clinical staff seem inured to that. Like there's almost an anosognosia of their own in not recognizing things that to the layperson would be quite clear. There's been something, something going on that is a great diminishment of that person that seems not only unrecognized by the person, but often by the people that are supposed to help them to heal.
Your connection was really not that clear. We got what we could, I believe, and I actually want to highlight, and I think that question was posed at Dr. Calvin, but what was the actual question, just for clarity, Russ?
Do you see a counterpart that's, to me, equally as concerning, if not more, which is a person's unawareness of the degree to which maybe a drug may be diminishing them, and also the unawareness on part of some of the staff about that?
Uh, yes. Um, the psychotropic drugs, when given to someone that does not have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, are crippling. Basically, they literally cut out their ability to feel things in the same way, to think things in the same way. And it's almost like you're disabling the person by giving them medications that they really shouldn't be given. Uh, Beyond just using them as chemical straitjackets for behavioral control, it's doing more than just controlling the behaviors. What can be done about it? First thing needs to be just knowledge and sensitivity, because these are things that we were taught 40 years ago in medical school, and it just was part of our education back then. And we had a different respect for medications and misusing psychiatric medications. Um, I see someone also psychiatric. Hi, Jim. Psychiatric drugs are crippling and disabling to people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. That's a much bigger discussion that Jim and I have over these years, on and off. Um, but I think it has to be considered. And it really comes down to, as a professional, we really need to be responsible for making diagnoses. And we always have to reconsider the diagnosis in light of what their response to treatments have been. Because, yeah, the Hippocratic Oath is first, do no harm. And sometimes we're neglecting that. I don't
I
know.
Ask a question?
uh, real quick, I just wanted to add in, is it a question for the doctor? For
Yes.
okay, go right
Yeah, I
ahead.
just had a quick question because I heard what you said. My graduate work is about sort of about spiritual crises. Um, and you mentioned that in the psych ward, and I'm in Canada here, but it's fairly similar, that you're not that well equipped to deal with spiritual crises in terms of being able to draw on different traditions and different knowledges about what's happening to your patients. But if I understood you correctly, but I'm wondering what I find to be lacking in
Can you
cases.
speak up, please?
Yep. What I find to be lacking in cases of quote unquote spiritual emergency and psychiatric responses is a look at the person's life. So, how are they doing? Are they going to work every day? Are they renting their own apartment? Are they able to maintain their apartment? Et cetera, et cetera. What I find is lacking is a focus on, is that person okay in their lives? And what can the mental health system do to ensure that they remain stable at the same time as dealing with whatever crisis comes up? Because what the system does often is it removes a person from their life and tries to call them mentally ill, slaps them with a diagnosis of something delusional, quote unquote, and gives them medication that destroys their nervous system. And what happens is that any job they had is gone, any apartment they had goes unmaintained and unpaid for. Like, it just ruins their lives. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that at all. That's definitely lacking in the system here. But in the case of spiritual emergencies, which often lead to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, bipolar, et cetera, is there any capacity to put more focus on the person's general stability in life in general? Because people do. The other anecdote was somebody who was a student, and my graduate work is also about my experiences when I was a student of having a spiritual crisis. Um, can you speak to what I'm mentioning? Like, when that happened to me, there wasn't enough of a focus on my daily life, like that I was living on my own, that I was paying my own rent, that I was working, etc. are there resources to make sure that people stay stable?
I may take a stab at that because you're really talking about good mental health care versus bad mental health care. And I'm actually going to be bold here because I do get to say something and run. As I see the comments about being against psychotropic medications in all cases, my father became catatonic with a major depression, and the only thing that got him out of it was electroshock treatment, medications, and he had 25 years of the rest of his life normal. His sister had a manic episode, was put on medications, and the rest of her life was normal. I've been treated for 30 years for a major depressive disorder, and without the medications, I get depressed in a way that has nothing to do with my life.
Okay.
It's a brain dysfunction. So there are true brain dysfunction psychiatric disorders. Unfortunately, because of, I would agree with many of the comments, money, big pharma, systemic abuse or misuse, the fact that it's believed or said that 1/4 of the American population has a mental diagnosis, I really challenge something like that. So we are definitely, I think, overdiagnosing, misdiagnosing, but I think we have to be a little careful between psychiatry and mental health and good or bad psychiatry and mental health.
Okay, so you're saying that good psychiatry would take into account the person's stability in their life, their day-to-day life. I just find that it's like people are taken out of their lives and they're ruined and they're put in the, I mean, maybe eventually they get better, but it's like having to rebuild your entire life because you have a nervous breakdown, rather than a psychiatrist sitting with you and saying, well, how is everything going and why are you here? You know, let's make sure that your life stays together on the outside of the hospital and we'll work with you here. But instead it's like sort of like going to a jail.
Yeah. Part of that is the jailhouse thinking that some
You can't go back.
psychiatrists
You can't go back, you know?
and and mental health professionals have, in that I don't think there's a session I have with a patient where I'm not constantly reevaluating the diagnosis, the medications, and how they're functioning in life.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So you do that in your practice.
Yes. That's how I think it should be done, because sometimes I think mental health, we forget we're treating a person.
Yes, exactly.
We're not
Thanks so much.
treating
That's
a
great.
disease. We're not treating whatever it is. So we have to include that this is a person maybe with a mental disorder, and we have to take care of the whole thing. That's why I said there's good mental health care and there's bad mental health care.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad that that's how you do things. Hopefully there are more people like you that you know of.
I, I
I'm finding
agree.
that.
I
Sorry?
hope so. It's addressing the whole person, right? And actually denying the spirit is denying 1/3 of a human. And because if we're saying we're body, soul, and spirit, that's a huge component. Scott, I do see your hand, but we're coming to the top of the hour. So I sent you a chat. I ask very
And
kindly that
I'm gonna have to leave, Judy. Thank you. I love this care from Allison. Cover ass, retain employment. That's probably a lot more prevalent than many other things.
Thank
Thank you.
you so much, Dr. Calvin. We appreciate it. I'm just gonna briefly share, my very quickly, I'm gonna share personal. I will share with you that Jim put something in the chat about this, the psych drugs. I personally was born with a disability, and I was told I would never be able to do A, B, C, D in my life, and I did end up in an institution. Well, they actually weaponized that what my actual disability was and decided that it was every you know, mental health diagnosis underneath the sun. And I can tell you, I wouldn't have made it through those years in that institution if it wasn't my spirit. If my spirit wouldn't stayed alive. And I actually have a saying that I have on every email that I share all the time, and it was believe it, become it, be it. Where would that come from? I mean, I don't, it's a part of the mystery of the human experience. And I know that in some of the darkest times and some of the most horrific, even enduring shock treatment, it kept me alive and it kept me fighting. And I went on to tell them that I would do A, B, C, D with my life. And that's when they said, wow, that's a little bit of religiosity there. If you believe that and that, well, first it was delusions, I believe, because it was out of what they had already defined my life expectation should be. And so, like I always say, is it delusion or is it divine belief? It could be creativity, or they could call it crazy. Is it innovation, or is it um, absolute? You know, we don't have all the answers. That's the thing. And so I don't know why we assume that we do. And I do want to share that when they at post shock treatment, post all the drugging, my dream life that was so special that I held so dear to from a young age was no longer there. And it was like the medications were there to crush my spirit, to take the last thing that I had. And that's a hard thing. I know a lot of people that have experienced that. And, I don't know why they would want to negate something that could, whether it is something or whether it's not. My question is, why would it want to be written off so quickly when it can provide hope that medication can't provide? So I just want to open it up with that being said. And I think that if people felt more comfortable actually addressing and talking about these things without retribution or retaliation, I think we would have more open dialogues because I can tell you that even me myself, I kind of took a big deep breath and said, should I share a little bit or not? Um, but I think that we would not be denying a part of our human journey. And we acknowledge there's a lot we don't know. And why would we deny something if it would be beneficial, supportive, and healing for an individual?